The corridor monitor showed a clean loop, except for a 4-second gap at 0217. I stood alone outside the nursery wing, listening to the hum of lights, protocol telling me to log it and move on. The gap should not exist. I paused, fingers still, noticing a wooden toy placed beneath camera 3. It was not issued property. The silence felt staged, waiting. The corridor outside the nursery wing was designed to feel neutral. Cream stone walls, low recessed lighting, no windows. At night, it flattened time. The guard stood alone beneath camera 3, boots aligned with the seam between floor panels, eyes lifted toward the small red indicator light. It glowed steadily now. It should have been steady all night. He had already replayed the footage twice on the portable console clipped inside his jacket. The system showed continuity, timestamp, audio hum, shadow drift from the ventilation grill. Then nothing. 4 seconds removed without a system fault flag. Not frozen, not corrupted, absent. He checked the housing manually. The casing screws were intact. No scuff marks beneath the mount. No evidence of physical interference. That bothered him more than damage would have. Clean problems were harder to justify. Protocol required immediate logging of any surveillance anomaly exceeding 1 second. The entry would trigger an automated audit and overwrite secondary buffers within the hour. Efficient, irreversible. He had not logged it. Instead, he stood still and listened. The palace at night had its own cadence, distant air handlers cycling, a single lift shaft humming somewhere above, the faint ticking of a wall chronometer down the hall. No footsteps, no voices. The nursery wing doors remained sealed, access lights dark. He lowered his gaze. The toy sat flush against the wall beneath the camera's field of view, a carved wooden horse, smooth from handling, one ear darker where a child's thumb had worn the finish thin. It was not part of the issued inventory. He knew the difference. Issued items were standardized, numbered, replaced in cycles. This one was personal. He crouched, careful not to disturb it, and scanned the floor. No drag marks, no prints he could trust. The stone was polished too often. He did not touch the toy. Instead, he took a photograph with the console, tagging it as observational media rather than evidence, a small distinction, enough to keep it out of the automated chain. Behind him, the corridor remained empty. He rose and checked the time, 0241. Shift change was 40 minutes away. If he logged now, the system would resolve the anomaly before the morning detail ever saw it. If he waited, the gap would persist into the next review cycle, visible to supervisors who did not work nights and disliked surprises. He keyed into the local access panel and ran a passive diagnostic. The camera reported nominal function throughout the night. Power stable, network stable, no maintenance flags. The system believed itself. That meant someone else had intervened. He sealed the corridor section under a routine safety pretext, activating a temporary access delay that would require supervisory override to breach. The alert would be subtle, logged as congestion management, not unusual near the nursery wing. As he straightened, a low vibration passed through the floor, someone moving quickly on an upper level. He waited, counting the seconds. The sound faded. He checked the toy again. Still there, still wrong. The guard made a decision that would not appear in any record. He removed the portable console from network sync, isolating the footage locally. It was a breach of data handling protocol, minor on paper, significant in consequence. He accepted it without ceremony. When his earpiece crackled, he did not answer immediately. He let it ring once more, eyes still on the empty corridor, before bringing his hand up to respond.
"Status check," the voice said. Calm. Administrative. The night supervisor's tone never changed. "Corridor secure," the guard replied. He kept his voice level, breathing measured. "Minor delay active, no movement." A pause followed. Not suspicious, just enough to register. "Reason?" "Routine congestion near the wing," he said. "Maintenance cart earlier. Cleared." "Understood." The channel closed. He remained still for several seconds after the line went dead. The decision tree in his head continued branching, narrowing. Someone with access had been in the corridor long enough to remove footage without triggering a fault. Someone had placed or dropped the toy. Someone expected no one to look closely at 4 missing seconds. He re-enabled network sync, but excluded the isolated clip, a temporary loophole that would collapse under audit. He would have to justify it later, if later came. He moved down the corridor, slow, counting steps. At the junction where the nursery wing met the private staff passage, the lighting temperature shifted slightly warmer. Aesthetic choice, psychological. He scanned the ceiling for additional cameras, all indicators active, all steady. At the staff passage door, he stopped. The access panel showed recent use, but the log display required higher clearance to view timestamps. He did not request it. Requests created trails. Instead, he placed his palm flat against the metal. The metal was cool, no residual warmth. Whatever had passed through here had done so earlier. He returned to the camera and knelt again, this time angling the console to reconstruct the missing interval frame by frame from adjacent feeds. The system interpolated motion paths where data was absent, a ghosting effect that suggested continuity where there was none. He shut it off. Assumptions were dangerous. Footsteps approached from the far end of the corridor, measured, familiar. A junior guard on patrol, eyes forward, posture correct. The guard stood and stepped back into his assigned position, body language neutral. "All clear?" the junior asked quietly, glancing at the sealed section. "All clear," he said. "Avoid this wing until shift change." The junior nodded and moved on without question. That was the culture. Trust the post. Do not ask unless instructed. Alone again, the guard considered the next required action, filing the anomaly report before the system flagged his delay. He did not do it. Instead, he composed a brief internal note to himself, memorized details no system could overwrite, the exact timestamp, the toy's position, the absence of faults. He looked once more at camera 3's red light. It blinked, steady as ever. At 03:12, his console vibrated softly with a system prompt, pending routine log submission. He dismissed it. The nursery wing remained sealed, quiet, protected on paper. But the gap remained unaccounted for, and with each passing minute, his silence became its own kind of record.
Morning light entered the palace reluctantly, filtered through high clerestory windows and heavy curtains that were never fully drawn back. The guard finished his shift without incident, filed the minimum required reports, and handed over his post with the same neutral phrasing he always used. No mention of gaps, no mention of toys. The night supervisor did not ask. By 7:30, he was reassigned. The notice arrived through formal channels, flagged as routine rotation, temporary placement on the nursery protection detail, effective immediately. No explanation, no commentary. The palace rarely explained its timing. The nursery wing felt different in daylight, softer, warmer. The stone floors held less chill, and the air carried a faint trace of milk and cleaning solvent. The vulnerable royal child was still asleep when the guard took position outside the inner doors. 2 caregivers moved quietly inside, their steps light, voices low. They acknowledged him with nods, nothing more. He observed without staring. That was part of the work. At 8:10, once the morning routine stabilized, he accessed the nursery's secondary security console. His clearance allowed review of movement logs, but not modification. The system recorded every authorized entry and exit, time-stamped to the second, cross-checked against biometric confirmation. He began with the night window. Most entries aligned with expectation: rotating guards, a senior nurse,
sanitation staff. Then one line stood out, not because it was unauthorized, but because it was perfectly clean. A senior palace aide, access granted at 0211, exit logged at 0226, authorized, no alerts, no annotations. The duration was short enough to avoid scrutiny, long enough to matter. Aides rarely entered the nursery wing at night unless summoned. When they did, it was documented with a reason code. This entry had none. He cross-referenced the timestamp with his memory. The aide's presence overlapped precisely with the missing footage. 4 seconds gone, 15 minutes inside the wing. The guard leaned back slightly, letting his shoulders rest against the wall. His posture did not change, but his attention narrowed. Protocol dictated escalation, flag the anomaly, request supervisory review, allow internal compliance to resolve it. Protocol also dictated discretion with senior staff, especially those attached directly to the royal household. He selected the aide's profile and reviewed recent access history. The pattern was sparse, appropriate. Daytime coordination meetings, occasional escort duties, nothing overtly irregular. That consistency, too, felt deliberate. A soft sound came from inside the nursery, a child stirring, then settling. One caregiver adjusted a blanket, movements practiced, unhurried. The guard did not look away from the console until the sound stopped. He closed the access log without flagging it. Instead, he opened a separate system, environmental sensors, temperature, light, door seals. All nominal, no forced entries, no alarms suppressed. Whoever had been inside had followed the rules closely enough to avoid triggering them. At 8:42, a senior officer from internal security passed through the corridor, shoes clicking sharply against the stone. He slowed briefly near the guard, eyes flicking to the console, then continued on. No greeting, no question. Pressure did not always arrive as confrontation. Sometimes it arrived as proximity. The guard adjusted his stance, hands clasped behind his back, eyes forward. Inside his head, the night replayed itself with added context. The toy, the gap, the aide's access. Each piece alone was explainable. Together they formed a shape he did not like. At 8:15, he was relieved for a brief rotation break. He did not leave the wing. Instead, he stepped into a narrow observation alcove and reopened the logs, this time noting micro-delays between biometric confirmation and door actuation. Subtle, within tolerance, but one entry showed a half-second lag. The aides.
Half a second meant nothing in isolation. Systems lagged, sensors aged, engineers accounted for variance. But the guard knew the nursery doors well. They were among the most responsive in the palace, tested weekly, recalibrated monthly. He checked other entries from the same night. None showed the delay. He recorded the observation mentally and closed the console again. Too much interaction would attract attention. Digital systems noticed patterns even when people did not. When he returned to his post, the child was awake. A small figure seated on the bed, hair still disordered from sleep, clutching a familiar wooden horse, the same one. The guard did not react outwardly. He shifted his weight, scanning the room through the partially open door, confirming caregiver presence, door alignment, window locks. The toy's reappearance confirmed what he had suspected. It belonged here. It had been removed and returned. A caregiver noticed his gaze and offered a quiet explanation. He insists on it, won't settle without it. Understood, the guard replied. His voice carried no inflection. The aide entered the wing shortly after, moving with practiced ease, dressed formally despite the early hour. Their presence drew subtle changes in the room. Caregivers straightened, voices softened further. Authority did not need to announce itself. The aide acknowledged the guard with a brief look, professional, neutral, no sign of recognition from the night before, if recognition existed at all. They spoke to the child gently, briefly, then exited within minutes. The guard noted the time. The door actuated without delay. As the aide walked away down the corridor, the guard faced a narrowing set of options. Reporting now would trigger review, but it would also alert the aide that something had been noticed. Waiting would allow further observation, but increased risk. Protocol emphasized prevention over reaction. It also emphasized deference. He chose a third path. At 10:30, he submitted a routine request for expanded nursery detail review under the justification of seasonal staffing adjustments. The request was bland, bureaucratic, difficult to refuse without explanation. It would grant him broader visibility without signaling suspicion. The approval came through within the hour. By midday, the palace resumed its usual rhythm: meetings, tours, controlled movement. To anyone else, the nursery wing remained calm, secure, unremarkable. To the guard, it had become a pressure point. He stood at his post, eyes forward, listening to the controlled sounds of the palace breathing around him, and waited, not passively but with intent, for the next irregularity to reveal itself.
The guard requested the item inventory under a pretext that required no explanation. Children accumulated objects. Objects moved. Accounting for them was considered diligence, not suspicion. The nursery's issued items list populated his console. Soft animals, educational blocks, bedding sets rotated weekly. Each item bore a code and a replacement schedule. The wooden horse did not appear. He watched the child from his position near the inner door. Morning light fell across the floor in a narrow band, catching dust motes that drifted slowly, undisturbed. The child pushed the toy along the bedspread, making no sound, absorbed in a private rhythm. The caregivers allowed it. They always did. At 11:20, during a caregiver changeover, the guard stepped inside the nursery with permission. He did not approach the child. Instead, he moved toward the storage cabinets lining the far wall, scanning labels, noting gaps. One drawer was unmarked, its contents arranged with care but without standardization. He opened it. Inside were personal items, cards, small gifts, a knitted blanket folded tightly. Items brought from outside, approved informally, tolerated because they comforted the child. No documentation, no chain of custody. The palace allowed this kind of softness in controlled doses. The wooden horse was not there. He closed the drawer and returned to his post. The absence confirmed what the inventory could not. The toy was not stored, not logged, not regulated. It moved with the child, or with someone who decided where the child's comforts should be. At 12:05, the guard accessed corridor movement overlays, mapping object trajectories inferred by camera coverage. The system could not track the toy itself, but it could show where hands moved, where bodies paused. He focused on the private staff corridor adjacent to the nursery wing. At 02:14, during the aide's logged access, a figure passed through the corridor carrying something small, held low, partially obscured by their body. The footage was grainy, inconclusive by design, but the motion aligned with the toy's size and weight. The guard marked the frame for review, tagging it as environmental observation. Again, a small distinction. He traced the corridor's path. It led not to storage, but to a suite of private offices used by senior household staff. Access there was controlled, but less scrutinized than the nursery. The palace trusted its inner circle. At 1300, the guard was relieved for lunch rotation. He did not eat. Instead, he walked the staff corridor alone, counting doors, noting camera placements, observing blind spots created by architectural choices made long before modern surveillance. One door stood out, slightly ajar, not enough to be obvious, enough to notice if one was trained to notice such things. He stopped several steps away.
The door belonged to a shared anteroom used by aides during long sessions. He checked the access panel. No recent entries logged. The system registered the door as closed. He did not touch it. Instead, he listened. The faint sound of ventilation. No voices, no movement. He stepped back and continued on, letting the corridor return to stillness. Back at his post, the guard reviewed the aide's schedule. Meetings, briefings, appearances. The pattern suggested someone trusted, relied upon, present without drawing attention. That kind of access was rarely questioned. The child grew tired in the early afternoon. The caregivers prepared for rest. The guard watched as the wooden horse was placed carefully beside the pillow, positioned just so. Ritual mattered. At 15:10, a message arrived from internal security requesting confirmation of routine checks. The language was neutral, the timing precise. He responded with the minimum required acknowledgement. Pressure was increasing, but it remained indirect. The palace preferred it that way.
The guard waited until the nursery settled into its afternoon quiet before acting again. He requested temporary access to the private staff corridor cameras under the justification of system calibration verification. The request routed through 2 layers of approval and returned, granted, within minutes. No one questioned calibration. He reviewed the footage slowly, not looking for faces, but for habits. How doors were opened, how long hands lingered on handles. The aide appeared twice more over the past week, always briefly, always within authorized windows. Each time they carried nothing visible on entry. Each time their exit path curved slightly toward the nursery wing before correcting. A small habit, unremarkable unless one was counting. The guard cross-referenced these times with the child's behavior logs maintained by caregivers. Notes about restlessness, difficulty settling, increased attachment to the toy. The language was careful, clinical, no alarm. He did not annotate the correlation. He memorized it. At 16:30, the senior aide passed through the wing again. This time, they paused near the guard. "Everything in order?" the aide asked. The question was polite, expected. "Yes," the guard replied. "Routine operations." The aide nodded, eyes moving briefly toward the nursery door. "Good. Stability is important." They moved on. The guard remained still. The exchange had been brief, but it confirmed awareness. The aide knew they were being observed, not explicitly, but within the shared understanding of the palace. Observation was constant. The difference lay in who controlled it. As evening approached, the guard received an update. Internal security would conduct a discreet review of overnight procedures later in the week. No details, no scope, just enough information to signal that attention was shifting. He adjusted his posture, settling into the long hours ahead. At 18:45, the child became unsettled. Caregivers moved quietly, voices low. The wooden horse slipped from the bed and landed softly on the floor. The sound was barely audible, but the guard noticed. He always did. A caregiver retrieved it, placed it back, smoothing the bedding. The guard noted how the caregiver's hand lingered for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, as if reassuring themselves. Night approached. The nursery lighting dimmed automatically, shifting to a warmer spectrum. The guard checked his equipment, verified seals, confirmed camera indicators. Camera 3 glowed red, steady. He considered removing the toy for inventory review. Protocol would allow it, but removal would distress the child, trigger questions, force explanations before he was ready to give them. Instead, he marked the toy's presence mentally, tying it to times, movements, access patterns. At 22:10, the aide's access appeared again on the schedule, planned, authorized, brief. The guard watched from his post as the aide entered the wing, stayed just under 10 minutes, and left. No toy moved, no doors lingered, no alarms.
Yet when the aide passed beneath camera 3, the guard noticed a subtle shift in their pace, a hesitation, almost imperceptible. He felt the familiar tightening in his chest that came when instinct pressed against regulation. The toy was no longer just an object. It was a marker, a way in, a way back out. As the night deepened, the guard prepared for the moment when observation would no longer be enough, and when choosing to act would mean choosing sides within a system that rarely forgave such decisions.
The order came without urgency, which was how such things were usually done. At 07:05 the next morning, as the guard completed his standard perimeter check, his earpiece activated with a direct channel request. The caller ID showed a senior rank, Operations Oversight, Palace Security Division. Not his immediate superior, but close enough to matter. "Hold position," the voice said. "We'll speak in person." The guard acknowledged and remained where he was, standing just outside the nursery wing. Morning staff moved past him in controlled flows, eyes forward, conversations muted. The palace was awake now. That changed the texture of everything. The senior officer arrived 5 minutes later, accompanied by a second figure from administrative security. Both wore plain uniforms, no visible insignia beyond clearance bands. Their presence alone narrowed the space. "We've had a review," the senior officer said, stopping a step closer than protocol required. "Nothing formal, just housekeeping." The guard waited. Silence was part of the exchange. "There's concern," the officer continued, "about unnecessary friction around the nursery detail, extra checks, access reviews, corridor holds." "Routine diligence," the guard replied. His tone was factual, unadorned. "Of course," the officer said, "but diligence has a scope, and that scope has limits." The administrative officer shifted slightly, pulling up a tablet. "Your overnight delay last cycle, unlogged. Not a violation, technically, but irregular." The guard met their gaze. "Temporary congestion management. Near the nursery, at night." "Yes." Another pause, longer this time. "We're asking you to scale back," the senior officer said. "Return to baseline protocol. No discretionary holds, no independent correlation work." The phrasing mattered. Asking, not ordering, yet. "Is there a security risk assessment supporting the change?" the guard asked. The administrative officer glanced at the senior one before answering. "There is no identified threat." The guard nodded once. "Understood." "Good, then we're aligned." They did not ask about the toy. They did not mention the aide. They did not reference the footage gap. That omission carried its own weight. As they turned to leave, the senior officer paused. "You're a reliable guard," they said. "We value that. Reliability includes knowing when not to create complications." They walked away without waiting for a response. The guard remained at his post, posture unchanged. Inside, the calculation sharpened. This was not an investigation. It was containment. At 8:00, the aide arrived on schedule, moving through the wing with the same quiet authority as always. The guard acknowledged them formally. Nothing passed between them beyond procedure. Inside the nursery, the child sat at a small table, fingers wrapped around the wooden horse, pushing it along a line drawn in pencil on a scrap of paper. The guard watched from the doorway, noting how the child glanced up briefly when the aide entered, then looked back down. The aide knelt to speak with the caregivers, voice low. The guard could not hear the words, but he watched the caregiver's shoulders tighten, then relax. Protocol said this was normal. Instinct said it was not. By mid-morning, the guard felt the effects of restriction. System permissions he had accessed the day before now required secondary approval. Coroner overlays loaded more slowly. Log queries returned summaries instead of raw data. Nothing overt, just friction. At 10:20, he attempted to review the previous night's camera buffers. The system displayed a notice, "Archived, pending routine overwrite."
The gap would soon vanish completely. He stood still, hands clasped behind his back, eyes forward, as the system counted down. At 10:23, the buffer cleared, 4 seconds erased. He did not react outwardly. Loss of data was not new. What mattered was timing. Someone had decided the window for informal observation was over. At 11 o'clock, the senior officer returned, this time alone. They stood beside the guard, facing the same direction. "You're still on this detail," the officer said quietly. "That hasn't changed." "Yes. But your role is protection, not interpretation." "Yes." The officer exhaled slowly. "The palace functions on trust. Undermining that trust creates instability, especially when children are involved." The phrasing was careful, concern framed as caution. "If something requires escalation," the guard said, "I will escalate." The officer turned slightly. "See that you don't mistake instinct for evidence." They left again. The guard remained. Throughout the afternoon, nothing overt occurred. The child ate, rested, played. The toy stayed close. The aide did not return. Caregivers followed routine precisely, perhaps too precisely, as if aware of unseen scrutiny. At 16:40, a junior guard approached with a routine message. "Internal security requests confirmation that all nursery protocols are being followed without deviation." He signed the confirmation. His hand was steady. As evening approached, he reviewed his options. Reporting now would be flagged as non-compliance with direct guidance. Doing nothing would mean accepting that access patterns and object movement around the child were beyond his remit. Protocol demanded obedience. Protection demanded judgment. At 18:15, as the nursery prepared for night, the child resisted sleep, clutching the wooden horse tightly. A caregiver knelt, murmuring reassurance. The guard noticed faint discoloration on the toy's ear, new, darker than before. Pressure, recent handling. He logged nothing. Instead, he did something smaller, quieter. He adjusted the overnight rotation schedule, placing himself on the late corridor watch again under a staffing optimization rationale. Approved automatically. No one questioned it. When night fell and the palace quieted, the guard returned to the corridor beneath camera 3. The red light glowed steadily. Authority had moved against him, not loudly, but decisively. He stood ready anyway, knowing that if something happened again, he would have less room to maneuver and fewer chances to pretend he hadn't seen it. The leak did not announce itself. It arrived as a discrepancy. At 1:12, the guard noticed a change in the internal briefing queue. An update flagged for supervisory review, marked informational, low priority. He would not normally see it. His presence on the late corridor watch made the system surface it to his console by proximity rather than clearance. He read it once, then again. A short clip from the nursery corridor, camera 3, time-stamped 02:14 from 2 nights earlier. The footage began cleanly, showed the aide passing beneath the camera, then cut, abruptly. No transition, no error code. The clip ended 3 seconds later, replaced by a still frame stamped "Data Unavailable." The caption beneath read, "Minor archival artifact, no security relevance." The guard felt the shift immediately. Not surprise, recognition. The original footage had been erased. This was something else, reconstructed, packaged, and circulated just enough to close questions before they formed. A narrative inserted where uncertainty had been. He checked the distribution list, internal security supervisors, operations oversight, compliance review. No field personnel, no nursery detail. This was not a leak to the outside. It was an internal release, controlled, intentional, the palace sealing its own seams. He stood beneath the camera, looking up at the housing, then back down at the console. The red indicator blinked steadily. The system believed its own story now. At 0120, his earpiece activated. Different channel. Restricted. "You've seen it," the senior officer said. No greeting. "Yes." "It resolves the question." "It resolves a version," the guard replied. Silence followed, longer than usual. "That clip is the official record," the officer said. "Anything outside it is noise." The guard did not respond. "You're not being accused of anything," the officer continued, "but persistence past this point would be misinterpreted." "Understood," the guard said. The channel closed. He remained where he was, listening to the quiet machinery of the palace night. Somewhere above, a door closed softly. Somewhere below, pipes clicked as temperatures adjusted. At 02, the aide's access did not appear on the schedule. At 0207, it did. Authorized, planned, logged. The guard's pulse remained steady. He did not move from his position. He did not seal the corridor. He did not isolate the feed. He watched. The aide entered the wing carrying nothing visible. Their pace was unhurried, their posture unchanged. When they passed beneath camera 3, the footage remained uninterrupted. They disappeared into the nursery wing. The guard noted the time. At 2:19, the aide exited, still empty-handed. The footage played through without interruption. No toy appeared, no anomaly registered. Yet when the aide turned down the staff corridor, the guard saw it, a slight adjustment of their sleeve, the briefest press of fabric against the forearm, as if securing something small beneath it. He did not follow. He logged nothing. The palace had made its position clear. Evidence would be curated. Gaps would be smoothed. What remained was not proof, but responsibility. At 2:30, the guard accessed the internal message board reserved for overnight supervisory notes. Buried between maintenance updates and staffing adjustments was a short entry from compliance review. Corridor footage reviewed. No further action required. Please refrain from redundant analysis. Redundant. The word was chosen carefully. He closed the board and returned his attention to the nursery wing. The lights inside were dimmed. Caregivers moved in practiced silence. The child slept, one hand resting on the wooden horse, fingers curled around its neck. The guard felt the narrowing again, options collapsing. By morning, the internal clip would be accepted as truth. Any later report would be measured against it and found wanting. The system would not accuse him of misconduct. It would simply disbelieve him. At 0410, he noticed a secondary anomaly, not in footage, but in metadata. The clip's compression signature did not match the camera's standard output. Slight difference, enough to suggest re-encoding. He memorized it. At 06, shift change approached. The palace began to wake. He prepared his handover report, writing nothing that could be challenged, nothing that could be used to discredit him later. When the relief guard arrived, the exchange was brief, professional. "Anything to note?" the relief asked. "Routine operations," the guard replied. He did not leave the wing immediately. Instead, he stood at a distance, watching as morning staff filtered in, as the child was gently woken, as the toy was set aside and then reclaimed. At 7:30, the aide appeared again, this time accompanied by a member of administrative security. They spoke quietly near the entrance, glancing once toward the guard. The conversation ended quickly. The aide did not enter the nursery. The guard understood the message. Observation had been acknowledged, boundaries reinforced. What the palace did not know, what it could not fully control, was that the guard no longer relied on the system to tell him what mattered. The footage had been shaped, authority had moved, the record had been sealed, but the pattern remained. and patterns once seen were difficult to unsee. As he finally left the wing, the guard carried nothing with him, no files, no evidence, no proof, only timing, behavior, and the quiet certainty that the next step, whatever it was, would not be sanctioned in advance.
The guard did not confront the aide immediately. Directness without leverage would only accelerate containment. Instead, he shifted to proximity, placing himself where access intersected with routine, where small deviations could no longer hide inside privilege. By late morning, he was reassigned to an internal movement verification role that technically fell within the guidance he had been given. Protection, not interpretation. Presence, not analysis. The palace liked language that narrowed intent. The aide's office suite sat 2 corridors away from the nursery wing, not officially connected, but close enough that the distance could be crossed without notice if one knew the building's rhythms. The guard took position at a junction point where staff traffic thinned, pretending to study a maintenance notice while watching reflections move across polished stone. At 11:42, the aide emerged. They were alone, no escort, no visible documents. Their expression was neutral, composed, the practiced stillness of someone accustomed to being unremarkable by design. When they saw the guard, their eyes registered him for a fraction of a second longer than courtesy required. "Morning," the aide said. "Good morning," the guard replied. They stood there, neither stepping aside, the corridor quiet around them. "Your presence near the wing has increased," the aide said, conversational. "Is there a reason?" The guard chose his words with care. "Staffing optimization." The aide nodded. "Of course, children require stability." "Yes," the guard said. Another pause. This one was measured, deliberate. "I understand there were questions about access logs. I've clarified my schedule with oversight." "I'm aware," the guard replied. The aide smiled faintly, not warmth, acknowledgement. "Then we're aligned." They moved past him, footsteps receding down the corridor. The guard did not turn to watch them go. He waited until the sound faded before exhaling. The exchange confirmed what he needed. The aide knew the scrutiny existed, and they believed it had been neutralized. At 12:15, the guard accessed the aide's access profile again. His expanded review permission still held for now. He focused on temporal patterns rather than frequency. The aide's entries clustered around moments of transition, late night, early morning, caregiver changeovers, times when responsibility blurred. He cross-referenced those entries with door sensor data. The nursery doors showed no forced access, no overrides, but the private staff corridor door showed repeated near-simultaneous openings, one door closing as another opening, a technique that minimized camera exposure. Intentional, trained. At 13:30, the child was escorted briefly to an adjacent playroom under supervision. The guard accompanied the movement, watching the child's posture, the way they held the wooden horse close, knuckles pale with grip. A caregiver adjusted the child's sleeve. The guard noticed a faint mark on the wrist, no bruise, just redness, as if from pressure applied too long. He said nothing. Instead, he noted
The opportunity came unexpectedly. At 16:18, a system alert flagged a manual door cycle in the private staff corridor, an unusual occurrence given automated controls. The alert routed to facilities, but the guard saw it because of his proximity. He moved without hurry. The corridor was empty when he arrived. The door stood closed, panel dark. He checked the log locally before it could be summarized upstream. The manual cycle had been triggered by a credential with high clearance, the aide's. He checked the timestamp. It aligned with the child's playroom session.
The guard followed the corridor's path to the anteroom he had noted before. This time, the door was fully closed, but the air inside felt recently disturbed, cooler, faintly scented with cleaning solvent, not yet settled. He did not enter. Instead, he accessed the environmental controls and pulled a narrow data slice, air exchange timing, particulate disturbance. The room had been occupied briefly within the last 10 minutes. He stepped back into the corridor just as the aide appeared from the opposite end. They stopped when they saw him. "You're thorough," the aide said quietly. "Protocol," the guard replied. The aide glanced at the door, then back at him. "You're creating a record." "Yes." The word hung between them. The aide's expression shifted. Not anger, not fear, calculation. "Be careful what you record," they said. "Records have consequences." "So do omissions," the guard replied. The aide studied him for a moment longer, then nodded once. "You should consider the child's need for calm." "I do," the guard said. The aide turned and left. The guard waited until they were gone before accessing the child's behavior log. He added a single factual entry under observational notes. Increased wrist redness observed during supervised play. No injury apparent. It was neutral, verifiable, impossible to dismiss as instinct. At 1800, oversight requested clarification. At 1830, compliance scheduled a review. At 900, the aide's access was temporarily limited pending assessment. The palace moved slowly, but it moved. As night fell, the guard took his position outside the nursery once more. The child slept, the wooden horse set aside on the bedside table, just out of reach. The aide did not appear. Pressure would follow, pushback, attempts to reframe what had been recorded as coincidence or overreach. But the guard had crossed a threshold. He had put something into the system that could not be smoothed away without leaving marks. And for the first time since the gap appeared, the palace's silence felt less controlled and more strained. The decision did not come as a single moment. It formed gradually, tightening with each procedural response that followed the aide's access restriction. At 21:10, the guard received notice that the compliance review would occur within 48 hours. Until then, all operations were to continue without disruption. The phrase was familiar. It meant stability was now the priority, not inquiry. At 21:22, the aide's temporary access limitation was quietly reframed as a scheduling adjustment. No suspension, no explanation. The palace preferred reversible language. At 21:40, an internal advisory circulated reminding staff to avoid interpretive reporting regarding minors. It cited child welfare best practices, careful wording masking a warning. The guard read it once and closed it. He stood outside the nursery wing as night settled in, the corridor lighting dimming to its lowest operational setting. The air cooled slightly, the stone floors releasing the day's warmth. Inside, the child slept unevenly, shifting more than usual, breath catching and settling in irregular patterns. The wooden horse remained on the table, not placed beside the pillow this time. A caregiver adjusted the blanket and stepped back, concern flickering briefly across their face before professional composure returned. The guard watched everything. At 22:05, he received a discreet update from facilities. An unscheduled systems test would occur overnight in the Eastern Wing, including temporary sensor recalibration. The notice was logistical, but its implications were clear. Movement would be easier to mask. Records would be noisier. Someone else was planning something. He did not know whether the test was related to the aid, to internal containment, or to something else entirely. What he knew was that the nursery wing would be less stable overnight, not more. Protocol dictated heightened vigilance. Protection demanded intervention. He accessed the contingency procedures reserved for emergency child relocation, rarely used, tightly controlled. The conditions were narrow: environmental threat, structural risk, or security compromise. The last was the most subjective, also the most dangerous to invoke. He did not initiate it yet. At 22:30, the aide's credential pinged the system, not for access, but for proximity. They were in the palace, moving through adjacent zones. The restriction had not removed them from the building. The guard felt the final narrowing. Waiting for formal review meant accepting uncertainty during a window of increased movement and reduced clarity. Acting meant violating the spirit, if not the letter, of guidance he had been given. He looked through the nursery door again. The child turned in sleep, one hand reaching instinctively toward where the toy usually rested, fingers closing on air. The guard made his decision. He initiated a silent extraction protocol variant, rare, discretionary, requiring post-action justification rather than pre-approval. The system accepted the input, flagged it for later review, and unlocked a narrow set of permissions. No alarms sounded. At 22:47, the guard entered the nursery with the senior caregiver's assistance. No explanations were given beyond the minimum. The caregiver understood enough to comply without question. They moved with practiced quiet, lifting the child carefully, wrapping them in a light blanket, keeping the environment calm. The child stirred, eyes opening briefly, unfocused. The guard stayed in their peripheral vision, posture steady, presence familiar from countless hours at the door. "It's all right," the caregiver murmured. "Just a different room." The child did not cry. They clutched the wooden horse when it was placed gently against their chest, grip tightening, breath evening. The guard led the way through a service corridor not normally used for the nursery. The lighting there was functional, cooler, less forgiving. Cameras tracked their movement, but the extraction code reclassified the footage automatically. Emergency movement, protected record. At 22:55, they reached the secondary secure suite, an older wing, recently furbished, used only when primary spaces were compromised. The air smelled faintly of fresh paint and filtered ventilation. The doors sealed behind them with a soft mechanical sigh. Inside, the guard positioned himself by the inner wall, eyes on the room, ears attuned to every sound. The caregiver settled the child, adjusting bedding, ensuring the toy was placed within reach. The child fell asleep quickly. At 23:10, the first message arrived. "Confirm location. Operations oversight requested." The guard responded with the extraction code and the justification category. No elaboration. At 23:14, a second message followed, more pointed. "Reason for deviation." "Security compromise, pending review," the guard replied. Silence stretched. At 23:21, the aide's proximity alert triggered again, this time near the nursery wing. The guard noted it without reaction. The wing was empty now, its vulnerability removed. At 23:30, the senior officer contacted him directly. "You've escalated," they said. "Not accusation, statement." "Yes." "You understand the implications?" "Yes." Another pause, longer. He imagined the officer standing somewhere quiet, weighing institutional risk against reputational damage, procedure against outcome. "Remain where you are," the officer said finally. "We'll convene." The channel closed. The guard did not move. As the night deepened, internal systems adjusted around the new reality. Access patterns shifted. Notifications multiplied. The palace began reluctantly to orient itself toward a problem it could no longer smooth away quietly. The child slept on, unaware of the machinery turning around them. By morning, there would be questions, reviews, attempts to reframe the extraction as overreach or error. But the guard had done what his role required at its most fundamental level. He had removed the child from risk. Everything else, the consequences, the scrutiny, the cost, would follow.